Daigwe ituno kena atia ono. Da iri mukaro agwebana boriken taino daka. I just wanted to say greetings in my ancestral language. I greeted you all as sisters and brothers. I shared my name, which in my community is Múkaro Agüevana. My Christian or colonial name is Roberto Borrero, and my family lineage comes from the island of Boriken, which today many people know as Puerto Rico. So I'm a member of the indigenous peoples called the Taino. Taino in our language basically means like good people, but it's not the same kind of good as the linear concept of good and evil that you would find in Judeo-Christian concepts. In other words, like at one side of the spectrum is good and at the other side of the spectrum is evil. Really, when we talk about Taino and what it means to be Taino, the indigenous people of the island of Puerto Rico, as well as the rest of the Greater Antilles, we're talking about right action. In other words, good meaning how do you act in context of the rest of the community? Are you doing harm to the community, or are you a positive influence on the community? That's what we mean by good. So the term Taino, we use it today to describe ourselves. We describe our nation, our communities. Actually, in the historical record, around the 15th and 16th century, there was these folks coming over from what would then soon become Europe. And this starts with the voyages of Christopher Columbus or Cristobal Colon. Now, those folks were coming over. I mean, obviously, most people hear the rhyme in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But really, that's all they know. Most folks don't know about the indigenous peoples or the native peoples that Columbus and his crewmates met when he landed in the islands. So the Taino people were those people. So we have a very real significant place in the history of the development of the Western Hemisphere over these last 500 and some odd years since that first point of contact in 1492. Now, the Caribbean islands, and when I say Caribbean islands, I'm using a real expanded sense of Caribbean islands because I'm including also the Bahamas and even the southern tip of Florida in what we call the U.S. today. So these were all part of the ancestral territories of the Taino people. And now I was just talking a little bit about what Taino means to us, good people, right action. And, it's a little different from the way we express nationalities today. Like people could say, oh, I'm American, right? And that could mean a lot of things to people. The same way people could say, I'm Puerto Rican, and that means a lot of things to people. But underneath that, within that, we talk about other ways of identifying, other ways of connecting to the world around us. And that world around us could be with other people. It could be with the flora and fauna or the animals and the plants, as well as the spiritual world or the energies that our folks interacted with over thousands and thousands of years. And we see that those energies as real, right? The same way that other people see energy as real. But we interact with those energies. People call them spirits. We interact with them in certain ways. And this is all part of the Taino way of looking at things, way of looking at life. Some people say cosmovision. Some people say ways of knowing. There's a lot of different ways to express how our ancestors and how viewed the world and how we continue to view the world. So with Taino, why I brought up the fact that it's a little different from nationalities and saying American is because it was more of a spiritual context, right? When we say we are Taino, it's about right action. So it's not like a hard and fast nationality like we say when we're American, but it's really about kinship and about will you and can you be part of that kinship? Can you be part of that extended family, which goes beyond just like the mother, the father, or that nuclear family, but it goes on to the extended families. and then those extended families make up tribes, and those tribes make up peoples or nations, and those nations, they expand in the Caribbean. They expanded beyond the local to the national, to the whole island, from island to island. And there's a lot of accounts very early on when you read folks like the diaries, like folks from Columbus or other early colonists or colonizers. Sometimes the modern or texts like to say the explorers, but they weren't there just to explore. They were there to really colonize. If we recall, Europe, as I mentioned earlier, it was just an emerging Europe at that time. It was just coming together in city-states. What would become Spain was just coming out of an 800-year or so war with who has been identified as the Moorish or the Islamic nations, right? And those folks were involved in a long, proactive struggle, as I said, over a number of centuries, and it was just switching to this Christian empire with the rise of Ferdinand and Isabella and Columbus. So all that stuff is happening at the time. So basically Spain had, or what was becoming Spain, really needed money, really needed resources. It was depleted with resources, both natural, human resources, economic resources. So they needed to go out and try to replenish those resources so that they can continue to be a power, or else they felt that they would be taken over again by the Moorish empires. So the way they did that was to send people out, like Columbus, to try to find new lands, take them over or establish trade relations. And they were really thinking they were going to find another quicker way to what they call the East Indies, right? And get better trading routes to that section of the world. And people know what happened. I mean, you know the history that Columbus sailed, and then he ended up running into the Bahamas, is where he actually landed in his first voyage. And he thought he was in the East Indies, so the story goes is that's why he called our folks Indians, right? And so Indians, East Indies, India, all of that stuff kind of links into what he was imagining and how we got identified. So that was the first misnomer. Our people probably call themselves many things to each other, and probably were called many things by other peoples who were in the area too. Maybe sometimes those things were nice, maybe sometimes they weren't. But this was the reality of interaction at those times. People didn't really call themselves like Americans or even Lakotas or in the sense that these are nationalistic terms. I'm talking about the Sioux or others like the Incas. You know, these are terms that we kind of have broadened over time because of the need to be able to explain it to people who don't speak our languages, right? And how we interact with governmental systems, educational systems, all the effects of colonization that kind of surrounded our communities over these last 500 and some odd years. So the Taino are no different. But what's important about the Taino is, one, is that it's the Taino territories are the first place of contact in the so-called New World for Europeans, for Columbus, and then those folks who came after him. And it's the first place where you really see the effects of the genocide and the oppression of and on indigenous peoples, right? Because remember, the Europeans were not coming over here to plant beans. They were coming over to replenish their resources, their natural resources, and to gain wealth so that they could become powerful in their areas and expand their kingdoms. And not only their kingdoms, but their political systems and also their religious systems. So that colonization was not only an economic colonization, but it was also a religious colonization because it was sanctioned by the Catholic Church, which was the most powerful entity in that region for Spain and for Christendom at that time. So they were really part of this domination process that really landed in the Caribbean, started there, and from that Caribbean experiment, we could say, it really branched out to the rest of the hemisphere. So it went out to Central America, South America, and then eventually into North America. And then you have others coming and other countries following Spain. So you have Portuguese folks, you have the French, you have the English, And all these folks made their way into the Caribbean before they made their way into other areas. So there's a lot of interchange over those early years. There's a lot of miscommunications over those early years when it comes to Taino people and the relationships that were built with the Europeans. So now I'll say Europeans because now we know, yes, at that time it was developing, but they became Europeans. Those sovereigns exercised their sovereignty over the lands and the resources that Columbus claimed and others claimed. And so our people were caught in the midst of this. You know, those folks were coming out of 800 years of war. They were hardened warriors, attack dogs, early versions of the rifle called the arquebus. They had cannons, they had horses, and these were things that were not found in the Caribbean islands pre-1492. So when you're talking about folks who who had a form of martial arts, who knew how to use bow and arrows, spears, and some other clubs and some other instruments, you know, but it was not the same type of hardened warfare that you would see amongst other peoples. So our folks in the Caribbean, our ancestors, you know, because they were islanders, one, this is some good things to consider when you're thinking about Taino people and our ancestors and the Caribbean and that pre-1492, is that the Caribbean has a year-round temperature of about 80 degrees year-round, right? It only has 2 seasons, sun and rain. So why is that important? Why? Because that gives the people in these islands the opportunity to have a year-round growing season, right? That means that at any point in the year, something is growing or something could be harvested, and that's just on the land. Remember, we're islands, so we also could harvest the resources from the sea, and there was not the level of pollution or exploitation or anything near what we see today. So at that time, everything was very rich. And this is why Columbus himself in his own diary wrote that when he landed in the Caribbean, he thought that that was probably the closest place to paradise. And he's thinking the heavenly paradise on earth because of this. And as a result of this year-round growing system and the people being able to work the lands, also interchange with the sea, it developed a consciousness amongst the people, amongst the indigenous people. It developed a way of thinking and interacting that was a bit different from the way Columbus thought. So, excuse me, I'll give you an example. When Columbus came over, the highest power to Columbus was the king, right? The king gave him the orders. Even though there was a queen, really the king was the highest power. And why do I say that? Because the king was also said to be a direct line to who they thought was God, right? So the orders came from God, it went to the king, right? And then it went down to the leaders who were basically mostly all men. So it was very geared towards the male dominance, that whole line. God was the father. That's what they say. I'm not making that up. God was the father. The king is the next father. And if you even research the word father in Latin, in the Latin language, there's a relationship to slavery in the word pater. You have to look it up, and you can Google that or do some extra homework for that one. But in that language, so it's all linked to this idea of ownership, but really male ownership and male dominance. Now, for the Taino people, for my ancestors, it was different. Why? We come from the other thing is Iberia, Spain, more of a dry place, different. The resources were almost exploited. It's a very different area than the Caribbean islands, right? So when they get there, in the Caribbean islands, we see everything as alive. So, and we don't relate that to, at first, to a male energy. For us, the world is consistently renewing itself. You can see that from a fruit falling from a tree. It starts to rot. It looks pretty ugly, but out of that, a new growth can come, right? So we're constantly seeing this over and over again in this year-round growing season and this ability to interact with the sea forces. So for us, if we use the term God, for the Taino people, that great spirit energy first started out as a female energy, and we say in our language, Ataveira, and she's like the cosmic matriarch. And then out of her was born like the sun and the planets. And so then we get to the male energy, which is what we say, Iokahu Bagua Marakoti. And that is the spirit of the yucca, which yucca is a cassava. It's a root tuber, and it's cassava, manioc. You get that in tapioca pudding. It's all apart from this yucca that we say in our language. Yucca is a Taino word, and actually comes from, it's related to a Tupi Guarani word, which is a totally different indigenous language. But because the Caribbean is where it is, we were the point of many exchanges over a long, long period of time. So the folks who Columbus met as Taino were thinking in a different way. We're thinking our God or our Great Spirit or our matriarch started out with the female energy. So God was the mother, right, first. And then comes all the other gods, male and female energies along with that. And so that clashed right away with the Christian concept of God, because they're saying God is the Father. We're saying, well, that's not really the way we see it. But and this is where some of this, so part of that, remember, part of that conquest was not only to take away and take control of our lands, but it was also to save our souls, right? Because Columbus linked the conversion of indigenous peoples as part of the reason why Spain, the sovereigns of Spain, King and Queen Isabella, should support his going that route, right? That original route that other people didn't normally go. Even though we know the Vikings sailed that way many years earlier. There's some talk of the Chinese also making those journeys. There's some talk of Africans. All that information is a little beyond the scope of what I want to talk about. But there are other stories. I just want to put that out there. Besides us hearing about Columbus coming over. So now we know that the geography is very different. So Columbus right away in his diaries, when he starts to see the Caribbean islands, he starts writing things down. Oh, these trees are very beautiful. They would really fetch a good price. They're as fine as any trees in Spain or in Granada or wherever he was. And then he sees these plants. Oh, we've never seen any of these kind of plants. They would fetch it. So he's starting to line everything up. And this is where you see that very beginning of the commodification of nature. This is a problem that extends today and why it's linked to climate change. So all of this stuff is intermixed, right? Because we're commodifying nature. We're thinking that we could just take, and it's caused problems. And we see where we're at. Indigenous peoples who are on the front lines of climate change and other things see these things very plainly, differently than somebody sitting in an office in Washington who doesn't see these things happening day to day, and who has the result and the benefit of thousands of years of observation. Okay, that's the difference. So, these folks from Spain come over. They come over to a different geography. They come over battle-hardened. They come out of wars. They're ready to conquer. They're ready to colonize. They're ready to save our souls. So it set up a lot of conflict. A lot of our folks died very early on. Why? Not only because of the warfare that was wrought upon us, but also the diseases that were brought by Columbus. And it wasn't just like smallpox in blankets, right? It was also there's also evidence that people knew that certain wild domesticated animals, for example, like pigs, were sick. They would let them loose into the environment, and that would also affect people well before the conquistadors would ever get there. They would also have sicknesses that would be transmitted in these ways. So there's a lot of biological warfare that happened in very early on. Also, they set up a system in the islands because obviously our folks weren't had a different sense of what a military campaign was, and our folks really didn't. And it's historically noted that Taino people, or the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, at least in the Greater Antilles, were not really known for going out and conquesting other folks, colonizing other folks. Really, they extended their relationships and their language group by arranged marriages. And you can see that from town to town, and then from island to island. So we find the same, that's why we can see the Taino language, even today, when it's not really spoken as a separate language in the islands anymore, but kind of mixed in the hybrid Spanish-Taino mix. But we can find Taino words extend all through Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, and other places. Why? Because our language group extended throughout all those. I'll give you an example. We have a yunque forest, a yunque in Puerto Rico, and there's also a yunque in Cuba. And it didn't happen after colonization. Those things were always named that, and they're still named that. Yunque, for example, in our language, people think it was meaning the mountain, right? But really what that word means, to give you an idea of Taino language, it means covered white. Because those mountains, the one in Puerto Rico and the one in Cuba, which is a flat top mountain, they're usually covered in clouds. So when we say yunque, iyunque, that means it's covered white, covered in clouds. So when you go to the yunque forest on a vacation in Puerto Rico and you're looking at that mountain that they say is the yunque, or the forest that they say the yunque, really in the Taino mind, it's because those things are covered white. They're covered with white clouds and fog and stuff. So we have this expansion of our peoples going across the islands, not by conquest, but by diplomacy, really, by marrying people in and out. So when the people traveled on their great canoas are canoes, and if you're wondering how our people got from island to island, from the Bahamas, across the islands, down to South America, across to the Yucatan, folks were using the Caribbean the Caribbean Sea like a highway. Our canoes, there was a Spanish writer. He was a conquistador, and then after he saw some of the atrocities that were occurring in the name of God, he decided to renounce his title and lands, and he became the first bishop in the New World. His name is Bartolome De Las Casas, and Las Casas wrote a lot of books about what was going. He was an eyewitness to what was happening at the time. And while some of his writings might be exaggerated here or there, or he may have a very colonial perspective when explaining or translating some of our language, he was an eyewitness, and he really saw a lot of what was going on. So he saw that that our people, how our people engaged, that we had arts, we had culture, we had political administration of that, but we also had relationships across the islands, and he was able to verify that. And that's why some of the Spaniards, when they went to other islands, they would take Taino as slave, they would enslave them, and then use them as interpreters to go around to the other islands because they could speak to other folks. So all of this stuff is going on. And I was mentioning a little earlier, so I don't want to lose my thought on that. Besides the conquest and the diseases that were introduced, another thing that really decimated the populations of Taino people in the Caribbean, which is probably why some people are still saying that our folks got extinct within the first 50 years or something, was because they tried to emulate what they were doing in Europe with the feudal system. They established something called the Encomienda System. And the Encomienda System would allot a certain number of Indians to a certain Spaniard, right? If they had a title, they would get a certain number of Indians and lands. Now, these were lands that already had administration and chiefs, etc., from indigenous peoples, but they were just taken over because once Spain got there in Columbus, they said, we claim the lands in the name of the king. So anybody who fought against that, they would try to wipe them out, or they would try to convert them. Many of our people fought and died. Some of that left the rest of the people in a quandary. Do we keep fighting and dying, or do we try to survive in some ways? So some people converted to Catholicism and tried to work with the Spaniards, and some people fled into the interiors of the island or the harder to reach places. Some people don't realize that Puerto Rico is not just like a flat beach. For example, I'll talk about Puerto Rico because my family lineage comes from there, so I know the island best. As a Taino person and as somebody of whose family comes there, it's not a flat palm. Like here's the sand, here's the palm trees, and that's the island. Puerto Rico has mountains and valleys, and that's really those mountains and valleys and trees are really which help bring rain, right? So there's a lot of fresh water. Another reason why the Taino people were very blessed or felt very blessed to be in those islands. Besides the year-round growing season, there's a lot of fresh water. Even when you're surrounded by salt water. So, you know, the reason why all of this is important is because these resources and these things that Spain didn't have helped them build up into the empires that they were, right? And that they became. I say were now because certainly Spain is not the same power that it was in the 1600s, right? And a lot of things have changed then. But at that time, they became a very powerful entity, just like others. But the reason they became so powerful was not just because they were smart folks. It was because they exploited the resources of others. And that was the natural resources of the Caribbean and South and Central America, right? And also the human resources, first of indigenous peoples who they enslaved, and then they also enslaved Africans, right? And brought them in to continue this whole colonial enterprise that they had engaged into. And by then, not only Spain was in the islands, England was coming into the Lesser Antilles, French was coming in, the French were coming into the Lesser Antilles, and all of them were competing on resources to build up their empires and their kingdoms. So all of this happened, and so now let me you know about the Encomienda System, which allotted Indians to these Spanish folks, but you know there was a lot of abuses, and I mentioned people like Father de las Casas, and right there in those early days, Father de las Casas and a few other Catholic bishops and priests, they spoke out against a lot of these. The exploitation that was occurring in the islands. So much so that by the 1540s, the King and Queen of Spain promoted and enacted what they called the New Laws of the Indies. And basically what those new laws said was that the Taino people couldn't be enslaved anymore, right? They had to be free and so that they could become Christians, right? And now, in essence, yes, this all sounds great. By then, a lot of damage was done, right? A lot of people had died. A lot of the chieftains, the great chieftains and spiritual leaders were singled out, killed. You know, the storytellers, the people of the history, a lot of the women leaders, because Taino people also had women chiefs, which is different from also from the Spaniards. The Spaniards really were not we're not used to seeing a woman in a leadership position, right? But because our Great Spirit starts out in the female, this female has to have a high role in the community. So that's why women could also be identified as cacique or chiefs. So granted that the majority, yes, were men, but this is the reality was that there was a few women chiefs. They were very powerful. Anacaona was one of those who was very well known. If you want to look her up and follow up on that historic figure at another time. But, you know, our folks were decimated. They did rebel. And interestingly, in those new laws of the Indies, there was a kind of loophole that was put in there. And the loophole was that any Indian who was found to be a cannibal or who was revolting or committing some kind of a sodomy or something like that, they could be enslaved. So why this was important was for two reasons. One, it set up this good Indian, bad Indian concept, right? That there were the good Indians who followed the rules, who became converted and got with the Christian program, and then there were the bad Indians who didn't get with the program, who were cannibals and who revolted at any chance they get against Christianity and the ways. So what the Spaniards did was anybody who revolted against their oppression, they would say, oh, those guys are cannibals. Those guys are Caribes, right? And this is where you get this dichotomy of the Caribs and the Tainos. The Tainos were the peaceful, the Caribs were the warriors, right? Because it was really part of that loophole that the Spaniards exploited, and then they developed this concept of the good Indian, bad Indian, the Carib and the Arawak, or the Taino and the man-eater, etc. But really all of our folks were warriors. We all had martial arts instruction. We can still name these pieces of martial art equipment in our language. Even today in the Dominican Republic, if you go and see a police officer, you'll see that club that the police officer has. They still use the Taino name for it. They call it a macana. and that's what we called it in our language, right? Those type of things. So you see how our language still permeates Caribbean culture, even in the national popular cultures of Dominican, Cuban, Puerto Rican. So much has been left, right? There's a legacy of our people, because remember, those Spaniards, they didn't know about the islands. Even the Africans who were enslaved didn't know about the islands. So they learned all this stuff from the indigenous peoples, planting, knowing about all kinds of stuff, rainy seasons, dry season, what comes out this time. They had to learn that from and this all permeated then into the popular national cultures. Now, again, I'm not saying that all Taino disappeared, but we can't deny that national cultures built around the indigenous peoples, just like American culture built around the indigenous peoples of North America, of what's now called the United States, or Canada. We were surrounded. That's the facts. Wherever we are as indigenous peoples, it's linked to colonization. That's a UN link. Colonization, indigenous peoples. That's the precursor of how they identify indigenous peoples. So where does that leave us? You see that our people were exploited. Many of our people, our populations were decimated by diseases and warfare. However, remember those new laws of the Indies. They came around in the 1540s, around that time. Now, there were still major revolts going on with Taino people in the Dominican Republic, for example, around that time. Cacique, or chief, Enriquillo, or we say in the Taino language, his name is Guaracuya. But in the Spanish, they say Enriquillo, or in English, they say Enrique or Henry. This chief mounted an opposition to the Spanish oppression during that time period, and amassed more than 3,000 Tainos to go with him into the mountains. And the result of that, now you have to remember, now we're used to the Spaniards and their tactics by this time. We could see that they're not always very honorable. And I could tell you a number of stories to show how they were not honorable. Remember, Taino people were diplomatic. That's how we expanded through the islands. The Spanish people were more warrior in their mindset. They just wanted to take over and make us in their image, right? So they didn't want to have multiculturalism going on. They didn't want to have a plurinational state. They wanted just mono-national, right? Which is kind of like what we see in the United States going on today. People just wanted to be one kind of United States American person, but that's what was going on in those days. So what Enriquillo did, Guaracuya did, was when he made the negotiations with the Spaniards, he did it over a ravine. So in other words, he was on one side and the Spaniards had to stay on the other side, and there was a long ravine in the middle, so they couldn't capture him, because he already saw that many times before when they asked for meetings with the chiefs, the Spaniards, the Taino would meet, and the Spaniards would use that as a time to attack them all and wipe out the leadership. And after a few times, he figured out, well, we're going to run out of leadership at this time, you know? So he was able to negotiate Cacique Enriquillo, the first treaty that took place between Europeans and indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere in the Dominican Republic during that time. Now, this new laws, again, the new laws, Enriquillo's treaty, all this is going on around the same time. So what happens is, what's very fortunate, remember I told you in the beginning, the Spaniards didn't come to plant beans. They came for riches. The islands didn't have that amount of gold that they wanted. So what happened? In the 1530s, they were already finding gold in Panama and Mexico. By the 1540s, Peru was the place to be for gold. And the kingdom of the Incas and all those indigenous peoples from there. So people were leaving, the Spaniards, when I say people, I'm talking about Spaniards, were leaving the Caribbean in droves to go make their fortune in Peru. So much so that the governor, who was then governor at the time in the 1540s, made it a law. And this is another thing that you can look up. I'm not making this stuff up. History is even stranger than fiction. But you can look this up. The governor of Puerto Rico at that time, so many people were leaving to Peru, that he made a law that any Spaniard found leaving the island to go to Peru would have their foot cut off. so that they would stay in the island, because they were in fear that the island would revert back to the indigenous people because so many of the Spaniards were leaving. So that's like the harshest immigration law ever, right? You know, you leave, you get your foot cut off. But this is actually what was going on in this. This is like Pirates of the Caribbean we're talking about. You know, this is really down and dirty times in the Caribbean at that time period. So this actually gave our people, at least in Puerto Rico, a kind of reprieve during those years, because it set like our people up to be a whole class of peasant farmers, right? A peasant class that eventually became called the Jíbaro class or the Campesino class. In other words, if you look at the islands and the way that you know, yes, we have a year-round growing season, but only certain crops the Spaniards were only interested in certain crops that made them money, right? They were not interested in all kinds of tobacco, sugar, coffee, things like this. Now, it costs money. Some people don't understand the concept of slavery and what it takes to enslave someone. Yes, there's the horrific idea of taking and controlling another person in all aspects of their life. But you can't just take and enslave somebody, and you have to feed them something. You have to have them a place to stay. You have to have people who watch them. All this stuff incurs finances. So in Puerto Rico, in the island of Boriquén, what the Spaniards figured out is like, well, why do we need so many slaves when we could just hire these peons, these peasants to come and harvest our stuff a few times a year, and just let them live wherever they're going to live on our lands or whatever. There'll be subsistence people that take care of themselves, and we don't have to worry about that. So then they would just come to do, and that's really how the Taino population in Boriquén and in other islands survived. Besides, you know, working in other industries like fishing. Remember, we knew our canoes. We would build canoes, our ancestors, that could hold over 150 people, and this was recorded by Bartolome De Las Casas. So you can imagine, at that time there was no artificial preservatives, the pollution wasn't. Our people were strong. They were eating healthy, organic. Now everybody loves it. At that time it was natural, right? Organic foods were just the thing to do. That was all there was organic. So they were all healthy. They were in canoes, 150 people going from island to island. So they knew about the sea. They knew when to go. They followed the stars. All of this stuff is documented by the Spaniards. Archaeologists look at the remains of our ceremonial courts. They know our courts were aligned with the solstices and the equinoxes. So we knew our time patterns. Our people were very advanced, much more advanced than the European has given us credit. And so you think about the 1540s, the folks were leaving the islands. It gave a little reprieve. And over then, most of the Spanish settlements in the islands, again, this is factual information that you can research yourself. Most of the towns were on the coastal areas. Why? Because they could go to the sugarcane there. They could be with the ports. They didn't like to go up into the mountain and the hilly areas because the rain seasons would cut off the roads. There was not really good roads. So it was easier for folks to just really do what they wanted in these interior areas. This is why when Africans who were enslaved escaped their colonial masters, where would they run? They would run with the Taino communities into the mountains and intermix with them and learn the languages, learn things. And this is how these towns, and even Spaniards who were poor, who didn't have the titles, they would run in there too. And so that's how you build up these, what would become Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Haitians, etc. So this is how it was built up. So it really wasn't until the 1700s and the 1800s where you really see the move of the Spaniards to get into the interior of these islands and to establish towns, towns that they recognize. I'm not saying that there wasn't towns up there or there was not communities up in these isolated areas, but Spanish towns that they recognize and that they would put in by their census. So in Puerto Rico, for example, there was one town or one region in the San German area, above San German, which is in the southwest area, that the Spaniards said from 1777 to the year 1800, there was over 2,000 full-blood, quote-unquote, Indians who were not slaves, who were not marked as Africans in this region alone, over 2,000, right? What happens is after 1799, in that the Spaniards changed the census, and they take the Indian classification. This is in Puerto Rico. Take the Indian classification off the census and change it to a category called color pardos libres, or free people of color. So that means that anybody from these 2,000 who were counted here, they were counted as Indians in 1 year, and then the next year that category disappears, and then they were counted in a category called free people of color. So it could be Indians, mixed between Indian and black, mixed between Indian and white, mixed between Indian and Indian. You don't know who was what. It was just non-white, non-Spaniard, right? And so that's what we call, we recognize that now as paper genocide, because they wrote us out of history with the quick pen mark, changing our category. So from that time to now, many books say, oh, the Taino people are extinct. Right? Why? Because, well, they wrote us out of the census. What are you going to say? What are we going to do about that? We were not empowered. We were not educated in the same ways that the Spaniards were. And really not many people were educated by book learning, even into the 1800s. That was a very limited class. And the U.S. itself confirmed this in Puerto Rico when they came to take over the island in the second wave of colonization, you could say. In 1898, when they did a survey of the island, they found that a very low percentage, less than 2% of the island, was what they would call literate, meaning they could read or read and write, or write, something like that, in the whole island. So, what kind of history have they been talking up until that point? Who knew what they were talking about? Who knew what they were writing down? It was only an elite class who wanted to control the historical memory of the nation. That's who was in control. So why I say that's very important, because I'm going to go back one more story before I try to wrap this up here. When we said the new laws of the Indies, I think you remember that, it was around the 1540s. In Puerto Rico, they were very excited about this, and they had this idea that they would read the new laws to the native peoples who were there in Puerto Rico to say, you're free, look, the king, queen made you free. So what happened was, when the bishop was going to organize this reading of the new laws, they went to do it in San Juan, which is in the upper eastern, the northeastern portion of the island, and in the port city, and one of the main is the capital city. And so what they did was they said that, well, we want to have the natives in the audience when we read it. And so that day, they went around to whoever was painting the house, whoever was watching the chickens, whoever was that. They gathered them up in the square, and there was about 60 native people gathered. Again, this is historical, written down historical evidence. They gathered 60 Indians to hear the reading of the new laws. Now, 60 Indians were gathered from that area in San Juan on that day. What we're not saying that it was 60 Indians in the whole island. What we're saying is, just in that vicinity, when they read the new laws, there were 60 Indians who gathered to hear it. Now, historians have used that and said, oh, isn't it too bad that when they read the new laws of the Indies to the people in Puerto Rico, the indigenous people of Puerto Rico, there was only 60 left. That's the manipulation of the historical record. So there was not only 60 left. There was only 60 that they gathered from that day around the town so that they could read. But they were not talking about the rest of the island. But Puerto Rican historians have used that as a way to say, from 1540s, when the new laws were read, the island's indigenous population was so decimated that there was only 60 left in the whole island. And there's where you get your extinction viewpoints from that are pushed now. And now that's changing, mostly because a lot of our folks have stepped up. People who, like in my family, my family is only 1 or 2 generations outside a wooden hut. I'm talking about a real rural lifestyle. And, they left the island because of my parents' parents left the island because of economic difficulties. My parents were both born in the island. They came to New York for a better life. And they thought, the way to do it would become American. And so a lot of folks kind of left a lot of their stuff behind because they had to assimilate. Remember West Side Story and those things, how people were fighting against Puerto Ricans. They didn't even know what a Puerto Rican was. But people from the Caribbean were being discriminated against. It could be a But remember, a person from the Caribbean could be very light-skinned, could be very dark-skinned, could have Afro-type hair, could have very Indian features, maybe indigenous Native American features. All of this was coming out of the Caribbean. They didn't know what Puerto Ricans were. So there was a lot of fights. There was a lot of intermingling. Of course, our communities ended up migrating and settling in New York and in other areas where other poor communities were. Who were the other poor communities? African Americans and others. So of course you mingle with the other ones. You kind of get in to build other things, build other relationships. But you know, a lot of our people who came out of this whole dynamic right around the time of 1992, when they were going to celebrate the quincentennial of Columbus, started to come out and say, well, wait a minute, you know, we're not celebrating. We don't have anything to celebrate here. We're still here. Our grandparents told us who we are, that we were Indians, and our people have really, there's no respect for our rights in the islands. Many of our people still live on our ancient territories and lands, but we're surrounded by a government that does not give us a voice beyond what they give the rest of civil society. And so that means that we have no power over our sacred ceremonial grounds, burials, education, etc. So it really put our people in a bad position. But what was the mistake? They put us in school. So many of our folks who were Taino descendants ended up becoming lawyers or becoming business people, becoming educated, and now we're writing the history. We're out there talking. We're exchanging with other indigenous peoples who've been through similar stories and uniting in solidarity around real issues. One, the recognition of our rights as indigenous peoples, and an organization that I've been a part of, the United Confederation of Taino People, has been at the forefront of this. We worked on the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at the UN level and also at the Organization of American States level. We were engaged in both those processes. And two, to really combat and be at the forefront for voices who are saying, hey, there's a shift happening here on Earth because of climate change. And it's not us who's making this change. It's not us who's producing all these things that are making all this pollution, you know, or affecting our ecosystems. So we're coming together to say, we're giving the world a warning here. You have a little bit of time before things go really haywire. And this is affirmed by elders after elders who have seen over generations, who heard the stories from their grandparents about how the land was, how the patterns of the animals and the birds and the fish were. And now people who grew up with those stories are seeing the changes. It's hard to predict things now in the Caribbean. So much so you saw what happened recently in Puerto Rico. We had one of the most devastating hurricanes, Hurricane Maria, that wiped out the whole island. So not only Tainos, but everybody. But you know what? When people were looking for water, they used the indigenous traditional knowledge, all those water fountains that were all through the mountains that are part of our ancestral knowledge, the manantials. That's where people were going for fresh water because that's indigenous knowledge. We know how to deal with these things. But many people have not given us the appreciation or the respect for our knowledge and for our place. So they have not respected our rights. So this is what we're talking about today. We're revitalizing our language. We have a lot of initiatives going on at the local level, but even internationally over the internet, we've been using social media as a way to catapult our message and our ways. So when we talk about community today, we're not just talking about folks who just live around in the same neighborhood or in the same village. Our communities of Taino people, because of the colonization, because many of our people got pushed out, many of us are in the diaspora in the United States, in other places. And so we're linking now our folks together using social media and technology. And also, again, as I said, renewing our ties and our ancestral ties with other indigenous peoples. So this is about a little introduction to who the Taino people were and who the Taino people are, who we continue to be, and we hope that we will continue not only to survive, but to thrive well into the future, if we have a planet left. So you better get on this climate change thing, everyone. Thank you very much. I say hahom ituno kena atia ono. Thank you, sisters and brothers. Masinatu kena kakona. Peace and blessings.